It's as wide and vast as an ocean, but Lake Okeechobee is the second largest freshwater lake in the United States. So vital to the ecosystem, it's been called the liquid heart of the Everglades. But the gentle poetry of that name conceals the fascinating and often tragic history of the lake, a history that's led to both life and death in the Everglades. Join author Charles Kopy on Battleground Everglades as he explores the history and the challenges of Lake Okeechobee in the battle over big water. Major funding for this program is provided by Eleanor Goldstein, Interactive Learning and Technology, LLC. Additional funding provided by
Lake Okeechobee means big water in the Seminole Native American language. And at 730 square miles, it certainly lives up to its name. But it's also big in controversies, which constantly surround the lake. It's been called a toxic, dangerous, destructive body of water, and also one of Florida's greatest ecological treasures.
Geologists estimate Lake Okeechobee began more than 6,000 years ago, when ocean waters left a shallow pool in the middle of what is now the state of Florida. Much has changed since then, but Lake Okeechobee has remained shallow to this day. Lake Okeechobee is the second largest freshwater lake completely contained in the United States, second only to mighty Lake Michigan. The modern story of Lake Okeechobee began in the 1890s when Hamilton Diston, a wealthy engineer from Pennsylvania, bought nearly 1 million acres of Everglades land and started draining the region.
And here's a more accurate photo of what it would have looked like. And then later on, the larger dredges came in that could handle the muck and the rock.
Archaeologist Christian Davenport is with the Lawrence E. Will Museum of the Glades in Belglade, Florida.
So Hamilton Diston and his company effectively made the Everglades profitable and made it livable for the modern era. Without his efforts, none of this would be here today.
Towns and communities fueled by the lake economy built up close to the shore. There were always weather events in Florida, but the people survived the inevitable damage and rebuilt their homes and businesses. But in 1928 came what is still one of the worst natural disasters in American history. A powerful hurricane packing 150-mile-an-hour winds and a deadly storm surge, estimated to be more than 13 feet high.
When the hurricane passed, winds drove the water south at almost 100 miles an hour, crashing into the beginning communities down here. These same winds drove all the water in the lake to the north end, into what is today Okeechobee City, killing hundreds of people there. So estimates are that over 3,800 people died as a result of these inland storm surges. Think of an inland tsunami. The survivors did whatever they could. They headed wherever they could to find shelter. Some climbed trees, some climbed on higher areas of ground, whatever they could do.
Well, I've been coming down to South Florida since the late 50s.
Author Robert Michael, a Florida-based grassroots historian, interviewed dozens of survivors and included their stories in his book, Killer Kane, The Deadly Hurricane of 1928.
Florida was pioneer country. This was, opened up land from draining, and these people came in and they just settled. So most of the people that I interviewed in the book were pioneers.
Even more than 70 years after the storm, the survivors' recollections were vivid and very compelling.
and the water just poured through and just washed away big parts of the dike because it was just muck and rock. And it kept rising and blowing down trees and houses, and it swept everything in its path. All of the people that were fleeing, trying to find a place.
My wife's father spent the night on a light pole between Everglades and South Bay on the old road there, on Dead Man's Curve, they call it now. And he and a black guy that was up there holding on to that pole together. The water kept coming up, they'd get higher on the pole.
When they found Mother, she was on this little knoll there, and they found her Tuesday afternoon after lunch. And there was an alligator and a black dog and a pig on that little knoll, and Mother. And she said she would have froze to death Monday night if she hadn't got that pig and that dog to stay by her and keep her warm.
After the storm, survivors had to work quickly in very difficult conditions to prevent a public health crisis.
The whole Everglades was covered with about 2-3 feet of water, at least up to your knees. And they're taking these bodies and they were just putting them up on raised road beds, which is basically the railroad because it had a raised road bed. And they're just lining the bodies up, and people would slosh through the water trying to identify anybody. And after 2 days in that hot sun, if they weren't identified, they were shipped out.
But African American and white victims were treated much differently. Black bodies were buried in mass graves or burned in funeral pyres. Whites were packed into coffins stacked on the side of the road and taken to West Palm Beach for burial.
There's been some efforts to rectify that over the years. There's historic markers at the mass grave site up in Port Mayaka. There's finally a historic marker in West Palm Beach where the African Americans mass grave exists. But there's still a lot of work to go.
Photos, many taken by the survivors themselves, offer a realistic look at the stark aftermath of the storm.
So Lawrence Will, what the museum is named after, he's actually the first Glades historian. He went around to all the pioneers and surviving families and collected this material, and people donated it to the museum.
Shortly after the storm, President Herbert Hoover and Congress authorized the Army Corps of Engineers to dig a canal around Lake Okeechobee and use the material from that dredging to construct a dike for flood protection. In the late 1960s, they built the Herbert Hoover Dyke, a much larger and sturdier version of the dike constructed in the 1930s. It covers 143 miles on the southern end of the lake and rises more than 30 feet high. But now, the aging dike is getting an upgrade, including installing a concrete-based water seepage barrier that should considerably reduce the risk that the dike would fail during another major storm. John Campbell is with the Army Corps of Engineers.
The dike suffers from its design back in the 30s when it was originally constructed, just using techniques that allowed seepage to erode the interior of the dike. And once we construct those features, primarily the seepage barrier that we're talking about installing along the southern half of the dike, constructing those features will greatly reduce the risk.
The multi-billion-dollar dike repair program is expected to be complete by 2022. But until then, the dike is at the top of the nation's list of vulnerable dams. To ease some of the pressure on the structure, the Corps releases water from the lake after soaking South Florida rain events and ahead of tropical weather like hurricanes and tropical storms. The water goes out to the St. Lucie River estuary to the east and the Caloosahatchee River estuary to the west. Weekly inspections are a routine part of dike maintenance. But when the lake rises above 16.5 feet, the Army Corps inspects the dike daily for any signs of water seepage or damage.
If the water in the lake is at high levels for long periods of time, that seepage would eventually cause enough erosion that without intervention, the dike might fail. So the Corps of Engineers, that's one of the reasons we do daily inspections, is to identify issues as early as possible so that we can keep the dike from failing.
The practice of releasing polluted fresh water from the lake to the saltwater estuaries causes damage to those fragile ecosystems. Those releases have been blamed in part for the putrid blue-green algae outbreak that fouled the area's beaches and waterways in the summer of 2016.
How you manage water in the lake, while it might be good for the lake, may cause problems for the estuaries because it requires fairly frequent discharges. Holding that water in the lake, while good for the estuaries, may cause environmental problems for the lake. So it becomes a very delicate balancing act, and it's something that we work with environmental groups, recreation groups, agricultural groups, all the concerned stakeholders to find the best solution possible.
While the Herbert Hoover Dyke has certainly prevented the massive loss of life in subsequent weather events here on Lake Okeechobee, it has also prevented Mother Nature from cleansing the waters of the lake in the ways that she used to.
Well, once you build a 35-foot high dike, it's no longer flowing into the Everglades.
Dr. Paul Gray is a staff scientist for the National Audubon Society's Everglades Restoration Program.
So that was the beginning of a lot of the problems that we have. And so now, when the lake gets deep, that dike is still there, and the water's not going where it's supposed to the Everglades. It's going east and west.
Researchers are studying deep water injection wells as an option for draining water out of Lake Okeechobee. Some municipalities in Florida use deep water wells to dispose of wastewater. They are thousands of feet down, below the drinking water supply, deep into Florida's rock layer. It's an expensive process, and once the water goes down, it cannot be retrieved.
We have two water problems. One is the wet period, and that's deep injection will help with that. But then when the drought starts, we've got to find water somewhere, and those wells wouldn't be able to help us get water back.
Some research studies have highlighted the benefits of deep water injection wells, but even supporters say they would only be considered in high water emergency situations. In 2000, Congress authorized the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan as a way to restore, preserve, and protect the South Florida ecosystem. More than 50 projects are a part of this plan, including creating water reservoirs and incorporating stormwater treatment areas. It's the world's largest ecosystem restoration plan, and cleaning up Lake Okeechobee is a big part of it.
What we want to do is we want to fix Okeechobee, we want to fix the Everglades, we want to fix the whole system and have something that works for people and the environment all at the same time. It benefits us all.
What researchers learn in the process of cleaning up Lake Okeechobee can be used to improve the health of other water bodies throughout planet Earth.
This is not unique to Florida. It comes with the way people do stuff. And so Okeechobee has a pollution problem. Almost all the rivers in the country do. There's a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico at the mouth of the Mississippi River. This is happening all over the world.
North of the lake, in the Kissimmee River Basin, there's a story of environmental restoration success. The Kissimmee River famously meandered 103 miles from Lake Kissimmee to Lake Okeechobee. But draining and development interests caused an ecological disaster in the 1960s. In 1992, the largest river restoration project in the world began. And after nearly 30 years and more than $1 billion, the Kissimmee River Restoration Project is getting close to completion.
We just need to do as much of that type of work where we restore wetlands and restore habitats north of the lake. And the healthier we can make our watershed, the healthier this lake's going to end up, and the Everglades, and everybody downstream of us.
Now, some have set their sights on restoring the mouth of the river, the last 5 miles that flow directly into Lake Okeechobee. It's a wetlands area known as Paradise Run. So where did it get its name?
I like to think about why our pioneering ancestors called this place Paradise Run. And I think I saw it myself, because when the sun hits the surface of these waters here in the open plains, there's a glint, there's a look of natural wilderness, of old Florida. As they meander past these palmetto stands, you see old Florida once again.
Restoring wetlands areas and habitats to the north of Lake Okeechobee can contribute to a healthier lake and a much more environmentally sound Everglades. In addition, some agricultural areas that surround the lake can employ best management practices and other projects that limit runoff and slow the flow of water from their property into Lake Okeechobee. The Buck Island Cattle Ranch is part of the Archbold Biological Station Research Institute located inside the Kissimmee Basin in Lake Placid, Florida. It's a 10,500-acre active cattle operation. It's also a research effort designed to help scientists better understand the ecology of ranches.
This pipe is basically measuring water level.
Betsy Bowden is the director of agroecology.
The land is owned by the MacArthur Foundation that's based in Chicago, and they lease it through a charitable lease to Archbold Biological Station. We're a nonprofit ranch, and we use it as a platform for our research to understand the environmental values and impacts of the ranch landscape.
So the cattle are actually driven to market or put to market like any other cattle ranch, and the monies go to support your work here.
Yes, it's actually one of the top 20 cow-calf operations in Florida, and all of the revenue goes in to support the research. We have a project where we're retaining water. So if we can hold water back up in the headwaters of the Everglades, we can potentially help solve the problem of too much water going to Lake Okeechobee. So this water control structure has about 4 feet of boards above the ditch bottom, and it's holding water back. And so without this, all this water would drain away.
So is there any discernible effect on the cattle with your practices as it is?
No negative effects. We were kind of worried because we put 40 of these water control structures in, but what we found is that we are holding water in our ditches and our wetlands, and that's good for the wetland habitat and the species that live there. So once the water comes up to the top of the board, it flows over and leaves the site. It's still leaving the site, but it's just a lot slower, and that's a good thing for Lake Okeechobee.
North of Orlando, Lake Apopka is nearly 50 square miles in size, a fraction of Lake Okeechobee, but it has many of the same challenges. It was once a world-class bass fishing mecca, but after years of abuse and neglect, it earned the unheralded title of Florida's most polluted lake.
You know, this is what's going on, and you can see that water coming up is pretty clean compared to, you know, everything here.
J. Barfield, a former real estate developer, created a way to clean up polluted water bodies that he's used in lakes, rivers, and theme parks all over the world. He's now using that process on 250 acres of Lake Apopka. His company manufactures diffusers that he places on the lake bottom that send thousands of tiny oxygen-filled bubbles into the water. The oxygen neutralizes nitrogen and other pollutants and kills the algae. He then adds earthworms and other aerobic-friendly bacteria into the water to eat the toxins.
We create oxygenation at the bottom of the lake. That changes everything. Most lakes are dead at the bottom, so we change that. And when we change that, the toxic anaerobic bacteria, they disappear. We kill them, not with chemicals, but just with oxygen. Step 2 is when that happens, natural bacteria that are in most healthy lakes start coming back. We augment that with bioaugmentation, which are friendly, good bacteria. And what they do is they work with the other bacteria that are there, and they start doing the way the environment was intended. The natural vegetative stuff that are supposed to be there, the Valsenera, which most people call eelgrass, can now live. So basically, in doing that, we also restore the food chain because the fish eat our bugs are eating the muck, and everybody's happy.
Eelgrass and other native vegetation are so important to the recovery of the ecosystem that the white pipes you see mark areas where eelgrass has been intentionally planted, now that the lake is more hospitable to the seeds.
Eelgrass drives a lot of things. It's the nursery for fish, for freshwater shrimp, and it eats a lot of phosphorus.
Former Florida State Senator Alan Hayes, a retired dentist, grew up in the area and was instrumental in getting the state to look into this way of cleaning up the lake.
Well, as chairman of one of the appropriations subcommittees, I was obviously interested in the financial aspects of it, and it seemed so economical, far more economical than anything else that we had heard of. And I thought, you know, that lake, those people have been fiddling around with it for the last 20 plus years, and I can't see any significant difference that they've made. And I thought, why shouldn't we try something different?
How do you know that his process is working?
Well, you can see it. You can see the increased clarity in the water. You can see the vegetation growing in the bottom of it. You can look at the sonar mapping of it, and you can see a decrease in the depth of the muck. What more evidence do you need than that?
So you use this process all over the world. Is it different in applications in Asia and Europe?
Yeah, we've worked in multiple countries, and quite frankly, it's easier to do business in Asia or France or the UK simply because the water's dirtier, because there's been more people for a longer period of time, and they've tried everything, and it hadn't worked.
The idea of biologically augmenting the lake with bacteria that are friendly and the inversion of the water column, where you increase the oxygen level at the bottom of the water column, makes good sense for any lake, any water body. It's somewhat like me prescribing an antibiotic for one of my dental patients. I don't have to kill all the bugs, I have just to kill enough of them so that I can give the body the advantage to go ahead and heal itself.
Another solution may involve nature's own tools. For countless centuries, the land south of Lake Okeechobee was home to a vast forest of native pond apple trees that naturally cleanse the waters. But that forest was destroyed by aggressive land development.
So Zach, we know that there were a lot of birds here. It was good bird habitat. What other things did the pond apples do for the Everglades?
These forests were the filter that once separated the waters of Lake Okeechobee from the headwaters of the Everglades.
In 2007, 1,500 pond apple trees were planted as a first step in bringing back the forests. But since then, much of the funding for the restoration project has dried up, jeopardizing the progress that's already been made.
No environmental work is instant gratification. It takes time and effort and commitment, and I can't think of an ecosystem more worthy of that.
So having native plants goes a long way to restoring a healthy ecosystem.
Of course, you cannot delink an ecosystem from its native flora. That's why experts continue to advocate for restoration of the pond apple swamp in southern Okeechobee.
Well, then you need to start getting that forest built.
Definitely so.
Lake Okeechobee is a study in contrasts. It's been the lake of dreams and the stuff of nightmares. Big water, and indeed, big challenges. But that's not the end of the story.
People have been battling over Lake Okeechobee since man's ambitious development schemes in the 1800s. Today, there are a lot of opinions and conflicting science to take into account. But this is not just a story of diminished wildlife or lost paradise. This is a story about the balancing of man's needs with the environment that supports him.
You're talking to someone who's been on this lake for 30 years and just absolutely loves it. It's the biggest lake in the southeastern United States. It's a huge lake, it's a huge resource. It's got fabulous marshes full of birds and wildlife. It's got a big open middle full of catfish. It also is full of water that we can use for human purposes. So this lake's got it all.
The lake is the heart of the Everglades. It is the history of the Everglades. I don't see it going anywhere. It's been here for the last 5,000 years. It'll be here for the next 5,000 years.
Major funding for this program is provided by Eleanor Goldstein, Interactive Learning and Technology, LLC. Additional funding provided by